all now. This meeting is recorded. I think Mitchell has joined now as well, or is connecting at least. So he should be with us shortly. There he is. Good evening, Mitchell.
Good evening. I'll be with
Glad
you.
to have you here.
Hold on. Here we go. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you. There we are.
Well,
Everybody happy.
Hello, everybody.
Good evening, Mitchell.
How are you, Mitchell?
Evening. Hey, Paul, where are you?
Back home in Czech Republic for a couple of days and then back to Basel on Sunday night.
Ah, brilliant. Okay, well done. Hello, Nick. You're in the boat. Excellent.
I'm in the boat.
In the boat.
Good. So we'll start the session. So this evening we have 3 different Avo cigars which you could have purchased to run through, paired with Nikka. So we'll have a few experts on those cigars and the spirits with us this evening. So we've got Nathan Shearer from Specialty Drinks, who some of you who've joined our sessions before will recognize. So he will talk us through the 3 whiskies. Maybe to start off with Nathan, which one should we start first?
I'd say we'll start with the Nicodase first. So a nice
Nika
kind of
Taylors.
gentle, easy blended whiskey to start with, one of the the starter of the evening. Nothing too complicated. Should pair nicely with the start of the cigar as well.
Perfect. And for the cigars, we have 2 of my colleagues from the US with us this evening. One of you might recognize because he's been on a Camacho session before, which is George Rami, who's the brand ambassador for Camacho and Avo in the US. And the second person is Shaya Goldberg, who is the brand ambassador for Davidoff in the US, who also kindly joined us. So any questions you have, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we'll try and get them to them as soon as possible. As I did mention, this session is being recorded, so please mind your language a little bit because it's going to go on YouTube. And if people can mute themselves so we don't have any background interruption, it would be great. I think we talk about the cigar first before we go back to Nathan. George, maybe if you want to do a quick introduction about the 2 of you yourselves as well.
Yeah. So well, I mean, you kind of hit the all the information. George Rami, we're brand ambassador for Avo, brand activation as well. So anything that has to do with activating the brand here in the US. My colleague Shaya Goldberg, we kind of share Avo, and then he also focuses on Davidoff. And today we're going to try 3 different Avos. We ask you which one you were starting with, so we're going to pretty much light up the domain. Most likely we won't be able to try all 3 different ones. The size that we're smoking right now, it's just the short perfecto on the domain. We don't have the whiskey here to pair it with, so we can't really enhance on that end. But this one, I would say, is what the good medium bodied Avo, in the sense of it does have, actually, and this one has tobacco from Avo's personal farm in the Dominican Republic. So it means a lot of just the heritage that this tobacco in particular has, right? In terms of the flavor notes, you want to elaborate a little bit on the flavor notes of this one?
Yeah, certainly. So the domain is definitely a whiskey's best friend. Both of them flavorful enough for the novice, but also subtle and sophisticated enough for the aficionado. This cigar starts out with that kind of quintessential Avo, Davidoff, old world hanky kind of barnyard hay. And then you'll notice the nuttiness kind of layering in, and a little bit of spice, predominantly like a baking spice, which should basically, depending on the size, with the short perfecto, once you get to kind of the full burn line, the spice starts to kick in.
On the retrohale, nice retro spice on the retrohale as well.
And a nice long lingering finish. So yeah, domain is definitely an aficionado's blend in the Avo.
Can you maybe explain a little bit for the people who might not know Avo that well, to talk a little bit about the history of Avo?
So Avo, the man, right? pretty much started the brand back in 85 with Hanky. You know, they became really good friends. And this, you know, kind of happened way before the Davidoff era. And, you know, with Hanky Kellner, world traveler, musician, a jazz icon. And he had always a love for cigars, right? And you know, at some point, he just, you know, met Hanky and started making the cigars in the Dominican Republic. And after that, you know, his first pretty much worldwide launch here in the US was in the year 1990. And it was a huge success after that. And, you know, surely later on, and, you know, a couple of years after that happened, it was pretty much acquired into the Davidoff umbrella, right? And that's how it became, you know, a complete global just brand, right? But this is just every blend, every aspect of the brand that we create is just, you know, to kind of create and further enhance the vision of the man that, you know, left us a few years back. But like I said, every single blend and just idea for each one of the cigars, it's based on his mentality, right? So we have a few colleagues here in our office here in Pinellas Park that spent years with him and helped shape some of the you know, just the campaigns and things, just to kind of, you know, pay homage to him. Unfortunately, I met him a few times before that, but, you know, it was a very pleasant person to smoke with, and just, you know, we miss him a lot, but we try to, you know, keep just his legacy going with the brand, right, and with the releases that we have, and especially the domain that, like I said, it does have tobacco from one of his personal farms in Dominican Republic.
The only thing that I would add, I think worth noting, is with Avo's musical background, he always brought that kind of orchestra or composer mentality to the blending process. So Avo looked at all of the different tobaccos in any given cigar as kind of, you know, their individual instruments, but in that harmony and in the way that they move together, the completeness of the blends. So it goes back to that, like the Avo Classic is a very traditional, easy, creamy, mild cigar, which is kind of the beginning and the roots of the Dominican partnership between Avo and Hanky.
Yeah, the Classic was his first baby.
Right. But through that development, even that Classic has got a tremendous amount of flavor and complexity for, you know, an Ecuadorian Connecticut, a fairly mild cigar. And as you move through the portfolio, that's really accentuated. So if you put yourself in the mindset, if you think about Avo as the pianist, as the composer, as someone who wrote music and performed music, and putting that mentality into his blending process with one of the best to ever do it, the way that they came together really creates these kind of complex, but also very approachable and enjoyable cigars in all of the lines.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about your background, Shaya? You joined Davidoff less than a year ago. So for people who don't really know you, maybe a bit of background information.
Yes, sir. Certainly, it's a pleasure. So I've been enjoying cigars since well before I was legally allowed to in the United States, and have been professionally in tobacco for almost 10 years. So as you mentioned, I've just recently joined Davidoff in September of this past year, rounding the corner on my first year, and to have kind of had a whole life really dedicated to the enjoyment of cigars and really appreciating the cigars, and then essentially half of my professional career in the industry to be able to work with the team that we have and these iconic brands is really something special. I started as a tobacconist. I started with a retail store in South Florida, and we also had kind of a prohibition style speakeasy cocktail lounge, which was in the early stages of like the new American mixology. But the philosophy was kind of just setting the theme between the ambiance, the old style cocktails and cigars, and then have kind of done a little bit of everything. I made it a point to work through every aspect of this business that I love so much. So I spent some time in sales, in production, in wholesale. And then most recently, before Davidoff, I was running a couple of lounges in the Miami and Fort Lauderdale area. And then been here for a year, and can't say enough amazing things about this company, which you all already know.
Time flies.
No kidding.
Wow.
Thank you. Nathan, if we jump to you quickly for the Nika days, you can tell us a little bit more about the blend, the history of Nicodase, how did it come about?
Of course, yes. So for anyone that's not familiar with Nikka as a brand, Nikka is one of the kind of founding pillars of Japanese whiskey. So Nikka started in 1934, and the guy that started Nikka is instrumental in the history of Japanese whiskey. Without this guy called Masataka Takatsuru, whiskey in Japan would be a very, very different business to what it is today. So Nikka started as basically a blending company. Japanese whiskey at the time was very heavily influenced by the style of Scotch that was coming out in the early 1900s, which was predominantly blends. We didn't have the big single malts like the Glenfiddichs, the Balvenis, the Springbanks. They were being produced, but they were never really being sold. So when Takatsuru went to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey and bring it back to Japan, it was all about the blends. So we're starting today on a blended whiskey from Nikka, which utilizes its two single malt distilleries. It has two single malt distilleries in Japan, one called Yoichi, which is way up on the North Island of Hokkaido. And there's another distillery called Miyagi-Kyo, which is about 300 miles north of Tokyo on the main island of Honshu. Now, these two distilleries produce two very distinct styles of whiskey. Yoichi being very full-bodied, very heavily peated, very maritime and coastal in its flavor, along the lines of, say, a Springbank or a Talisker or Highland Park or something like that. And then at Miyagi-Kyo, they produce an enormous amount of different whiskies, but predominantly on that light, unpeated, more Speyside characteristic. So the idea with Nikka, and one of the things that people kind of will always ask about Japanese whiskey is, what's the difference between Japanese whiskey and Scotch whiskey? Now, the first thing I would say is, well, one's from Scotland, one's from Japan, but in terms of production, they are quite similar. The main difference, though, is that there is lots more distilleries in Scotland. So if we take distilleries like Dalmore, Glenfiddich, Ben Nevis, Springbank, they tend to focus on one style of whiskey. That's why when you buy a bottle of Talisker or you buy a bottle of Lagavulin, it's going to taste like Talisker or Lagavulin. So they're known for that DNA, that one style of whiskey. Now, if we go back from a blender's perspective, that's fantastic because you have 160, 170 distilleries, and you're able to pick and choose and buy as much as you want and blend all of those things together. And that's how we have the Johnny Walkers, that's where we have the Shivers Brothers, the Haigs, all of those kind of old style blends. Now, when Nikka started out in 1934 in Japan, there was only one other distillery in Japan at the time. So that was Yamazaki. And Takatsuru had actually worked with Shinjiro Tori at Yamazaki for a while, and they had a pretty unceremonious falling out. So there was no way they were going to start swapping casks with each other. So the distillers in Japan had to kind of tweak the production methods of the whiskey a little bit. Whereas in Scotland, each distillery tends to follow its recipe and it produces a consistent style of single malt. In Japan, the goal here is complexity and diversity. So each distillery that Nikka owns, so Miyagi-Kyo and Yoichi, they produce over 600 different styles of whiskey. And they do that by tweaking things like fermentation times, checking the peat levels in the barley. Do we go a little bit smoky? Do we not go smoky? Then there's longer fermentations, different yeast strains, and distillations as well. So when we think about Japanese whiskey companies in general, it's the same for Suntory. I was focused more on blending than about production because just like with cigars, each component part is going to give a certain element to the blend. So the Nicodase is made up of those two single malt distilleries, Yoichi being rich and peaty and oily and salty and a little bit more maritime in its flavor. Miyagi-Kyo being light, soft, elegant, very green and very grassy. And then the final component is the coffee grain. Now, we are going to taste the coffee grain separately, but the coffee grain is a very integral part to the blending process in Japan. Now, I always kind of think, Mark Thompson from Glenfiddich was on a call, I think it was about a month ago, and he had this brilliant analogy of, what a blended whiskey is. So if you think of it like a pizza, so your grain whiskey, that is the dough. That's the thing that holds everything together. You then have your kind of filler malts, which are going to be great for adding a little bit more structure and a little bit more seasoning to the top. And then you have your kind of, wow factor malts, which are going to give you all of those seasoning elements. So like the pepperoni or the mozzarella, that's going to be your big flavor profiles. So the coffee grain is that beautiful baseline, elegant base to the whiskey. So what we have here is the coffee grain whiskey, which we'll talk a bit more in depth when we actually taste this one. But this is a predominantly corn-based whiskey. So a very, very rich and elegant sipping whiskey that also has amazing amounts of flavor. But no one really bothers using coffee stills anymore in the whiskey distilleries because they're too expensive to run. But what this gives us is a really nice base layer to the whiskey. We then add a little bit of seasoning on the top of that in the form of the single malts. And what we end up with is a really bright, fresh, elegant, green, grassy whiskey that's perfect for this kind of summer's evening. Goes really, really well with the start of a cigar, where you've got that beautiful kind of lightness and freshness coming in, that toasted aroma characteristic. So this was 40% ABV. It's aged for around the sort of 8 to 10 year mark, and it's predominantly grain whiskey with those single malts kind of added in on top. But Nikka is all about blending. So when we're pairing and talking about cigars, it's a really nice kind of narrative to have.
Great, thank you. George, if we go back to Avo for a bit, can you tell us a little bit more about Avo himself? You know, how did he get into cigars? Obviously, he was a very passionate musician, but how did he really get into cigars?
You want to
Sure.
kind of...
So it's an interesting anecdote and a story. Avo at his concerts and his performances used to always make cigars available for people while they were enjoying his music. And then in his later years, he took ownership of a restaurant and bar in Puerto Rico, and he had a piano that he would play in kind of the main galley, and there were always cigars available on the piano. Avo, if you've ever had a chance to meet the man, Avo is a true consummate gentleman, but also loved almost nothing more, and I say almost nothing more, than sharing a cigar with friends. The two things would probably be music and women. But third,
exactly. I was gonna say that his appetite for women.
very closely third would be sharing cigars. So these cigars were always available, complimentary for people in the restaurant and lounge at his piano table while he would perform. And over the years, he would have people visiting, lots of people from the States, and they would call back and ask how they could obtain more of these cigars. Now, as George mentioned, these are cigars that Avo had made in the Dominican Republic. And over the years, even before the Avo brand, he and Henke Kellner developed a relationship and started to create these cigars for Avo's personal enjoyment, for Henke's personal enjoyment, and then to be on display in this bar and restaurant. So over the time, as more and more people started asking for more of these cigars, in the beginning, the answer was always, well, you have to come and see me play. And then in very short order, the realization that there was really something potentially marketable and a brand kind of developed from there.
Yeah, his wife had a lot to do with it as well. She would always encourage him to, just look for the best. And at some point, with these cigars, Avo had problems with construction, quality of the cigars. He wasn't really happy, right? So at some point, he managed to, get a hold of the best in the business, which is, Henke Kellner, and they develop a friendship. And that's how, pretty much the cigars got made in Dominican Republic, and they're still made there until this day, 30 plus years later after the brand was born. But yeah, pretty much, it was his wife that had a lot to do with it, kind of pushing him to just look for the best tobacco, best master blenders, and also the just his love for the tropics, right? The Caribbean. He wanted to stay in the Caribbean, and he managed to, become really good friends with Henke, and then that's how the Avo brand got started.
So Avo passed away about 4.5 years ago, I think. So kind of till what period of time was he involved in the blending process?
Well, towards the end, unfortunately, a couple of years prior to him passing away, he had a car accident, right? And that kind of diminished his ability to move around, and just, it kind of probably shaved off a few years off of his life, right? It was unfortunate. But prior to that, the last one that he was really involved in, he was able to see the birth of the Synchro series, right? And he was able to be heavily involved in the release of the Synchro Nicaragua, which was the first one, that box press. And if you see some, there's pictures around on the internet. If you type Avo Synchro Nicaragua, you'll see him holding that cigar. And that's the last one that he was heavily involved in before, unfortunately, he had that decay in terms of his health right? And his last days were in Orlando. That's pretty much the last few times that I was able to see him. And he always had cigars with him, right? Happens to be that the Domain was actually one of his favorite ones, that he would have them always with him unbanded. And we would give those away to, anybody, whoever would come and talk to him. He'll be like, let me give you a cigar. I always have that in my head. But yeah, the Cinco Nicaragua was the last one that he was heavily involved in. And then unfortunately his health was, like I said, it was, it started to decay a little bit. And after that, it was just us trying to, keep with his thoughts, his mentality, the blends, the superior quality of tobacco that he always looked for. And actually today we're releasing the 4th installment of the Synchro series, the Synchro Caribe. So this is, also happens to revolve around the Caribbean. And it's just a cigar that Avo would definitely be very proud of, just because it kind of brings everything that he really wanted together, just all the whole Caribbean vibe, and in terms of just a cigar and the blend, right? And just the whole, aspect of that cigar in particular. So this one, it's for him.
So we had a question here from Karen. Karen joins our virtual events on a regular basis. She has a question about the Improvisation Series. So when did they start, and which ones are your favorite?
So last year we had the 9th installment of the Improvisation Series. So it's kind of like it gets released around Avo's birthday, right? Every year for the past 9 years. All the blends are different, right? But I will have to say that, for example, the last few years has been hard to compete. The 2018 was one of my absolute favorite ones, right? That big double Corona with that nice Connecticut shade wrapper that it had. It's just something about the size. I love bigger cigars, right? But it's a tough one as well, because the 2021 that we just released early this year is an outstanding blend as well. I'm not sure if some of you guys have been able to try that one. Outstanding, and it's also in a double Corona. It's got a little bit more body than the 2018, but it certainly hits all those aspects of a cigar that a connoisseur would enjoy, right? Medium to full bodied, perfect draw, just that, all the oils, once it gets to combust, that flavor, it's just a harmony of senses, right? It becomes
I'm afraid it went tonight.
Oh,
That's the last day.
the beauty of live television.
yeah.
Who's left team? Yeah.
Want to explain? It keeps on muting. Please mute yourself, Gio. Trying to find him now.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Cheers.
Okay, you should be good to go again.
Muted. Good.
Yeah, the next one that we're going to release on that one is going to be a very interesting fusion of characters and that blend and everything that's going to have to do with that next Avo Improvisation. Going to come around the Avo's birthday as well. So I'll just throw that one out there. Can't really say much about it, but it's going to be a very cool blend and visuals on that project. So we're really excited about that one. It's in the works already. Like I said, I couldn't really much, but it's going to be a very interesting one. Probably one of the most interesting ones to date.
Yeah, it's a tribute to the history and the legacy of Avo, and also the current and the future of the brand. It's kind of everything in one. It's going to be a very fun project.
I think the one which was most popular in the UK since I've joined Avo, at least, was the 2019. I think that sold really well in the UK, and I think a lot of people in the UK still think that's their favorite to date. It sold really well. So the double Corona.
It was an untraditionally big ring gauge for the Improv. Actually, I was walking around earlier today, and I saw a box of those, and I opened it up, and I was like, wow, it's funny that you mentioned the 2019. It came with a big hefty box. big ring gauge, box press. Very interesting one. Yes, absolutely.
Actually, real quick, Roy, I have a question for you based on that. So I have this kind of natural assumption with European cigar aficionados in general, which is generally, more classic, very, very vintage vitolas. When would you say, and how would you say the evolution of larger ring gauges and box presses, I mean, obviously with the 2019 becoming one of the most popular, about when do you think that happened?
I think it probably changed a little bit about 5 years ago. Box press became a bit more common to see in the market. What we see now, funny enough, currently, is that people have a demand again for smaller ring gauges. So a lot of people are looking again for Lanceros and that kind of type. I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago when people really started taking notice of box press. I think box press is a funny thing. People either love it or hate it.
Right.
Because of the size, and some people find it doesn't sit right in their hand or doesn't sit right in their mouth. The benefit, obviously, it doesn't roll off your table, which is
that's a plus.
Which is a great plus for many people. But yeah, no, I think box press is definitely seeing more traction in the market. If we look at Davidoff, the Davidoff Nicaraguan box press, it's very popular here in both the Robusto and the Toro. So yeah, it's been a few years, yeah. But I agree. Initially, it was very traditional, but the UK or Europe in itself has always been a very Cuban market. And it was also about 5-6 years ago where we saw kind of that shift and New World taking more of a market share into New World cigars. So that's been positive.
Did you guys get the regionals, the North and South?
No, because they're US only.
That was just US only. Okay.
Yeah. Same as the one you mentioned just now, the Caribe. That's also US only.
We're going to have to put some together and send them to you, right?
Yes.
Yeah, if you could, yes, please. That would be great. A question for Nathan. Which whiskey next?
Next whiskey is going to be the coffee grain whiskey, actually. So this is a really, really interesting whiskey. Grain whiskey for sure doesn't have the same sort of gravitas or prestige as the single malts, but it is vital when it comes to creating a good blended whiskey. So Nika took the production of grain whiskey really seriously. So when Takatsuru went to Scotland to learn how to produce whiskey, he worked at a few different distilleries in Scotland alongside studying at Glasgow. So he worked at Longmorn, one of those key single malts that goes into Chivas Regal, absolutely stunning Speyside style whiskey, still quite bold, but with that kind of fruity, zesty marzipan kind of characteristic to it. He also worked at Hazelburn when it was a standalone distillery on Campbelltown. And the third distillery he worked at was called Bowness. So it's it used to be between Edinburgh and Glasgow. It was a grain whiskey distillery called James Calder Distillery. And this is where he learned how to use something called the coffee still. So if anyone's kind of looked at their whiskey and gone, how do they get the coffee beans in there? Where's the coffee flavor coming from? This has absolutely nothing to do with espressos, macchiatos, cortados, flat whites, anything like that. The coffee here refers to the type of distillation that's used. So to be a single malt whiskey, you need to have a few different things. So you need to be made at one distillery, the single part. You need to be made from malted barley, and you must be distilled in a pot still. Now, if you break one of those rules, then you can no longer be called a single malt. And grain whiskies, by their definition, tend to not be made in pot stills because it's much, much more efficient to distill something continuously in a large column still. So it's kind of thinking, what kind of flavors do you get out of a column still generally? They tend to be lighter in flavor than pot still distillations. A really nice, easy way to think about this is think about a more Spanish style rum, so like Bacardi or Havana Club, something like that. It's quite light, it's quite grassy, it's quite vegetal, and that's because it's gone through a column still, predominantly. If we take a trip over to somewhere like Jamaica, that's where we've got bigger, bolder, more funky styles of rum with a lot more texture. That tends to be what pot still distillation gives you. So the coffee still was invented in the 1830s by an Irishman called Aeneas Coffey, and his job back then in Ireland was to go around looking for all of these illicit distillers to try and tax them. So in his day-to-day job, he would have seen hundreds upon hundreds of these pot stills, the things that we make our single malt or single pot still whiskey on. And he must have thought, there's got to be a more efficient way to distill these things. You know, we don't need to fill these copper kettles up, distill, clean them, and start again all the time. There's got to be a mechanism or a way in which we can produce grain whiskey more cheaply. And so he came up with this design, which basically has two columns. You feed in beer on one side, and then you feed in steam on the other side. And basically you keep a loop going through, which allows you to distill continuously 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. So this revolutionized the distilling industry, because before then, everything was done in these small copper pots, and everything was always quite bold, quite big, and a bit more powerful. So he took this invention to the Irish distillers, and they all said, nope, we want nothing to do with this. It creates something that was nicknamed silent spirit. So a lot of the distillers said, we don't like what you're doing with this thing. You're taking away all of the soul of the whiskey. So Coffey took it over to Scotland, who jumped at the idea to start producing some grain whiskey. And then this kind of kick-started the whole blended whiskey category. So around the 1850s, 1860s, we see blends really starting to dominate. And they were made of grain whiskey and these two single malts. Now, the coffee still hasn't changed much in 200 years. It's a very old piece of technology. It's a lot more modern than a pot still, but it's very, very old technology by today's standards. If you think these days, we've gone to the moon, we have calculators and entire computers in our pocket. Technology's come a really long way. But Nika still keeps the coffee still there because it's so old, because it's so inefficient. Those inefficiencies create or trap the flavor. So if we think about a spirit, it's made up of lots of esters and aldehydes and flavors. The more precise we make that spirit, the less of these flavors there are. Think about a 27 times distilled vodka. It's probably not going to taste like much. Whereas something coming off a pot still has loads of flavor and loads of acids and loads of these big, bold, long chain hydrocarbons. So the coffee still is more efficient than pot still distillation, but it's nowhere near as efficient as modern day column stills. So Nika could have chosen to use something a bit more modern, but because Takatsuru learned to distill on this type of coffee still, Nika keep it there to this day. And it just creates a much more, in my opinion, a much bolder grain whiskey. So these days, if you taste grain whiskeys, you might think, yeah, it's just a bit light, a bit kind of floral. There's nothing much to it. Because of the way that this one's distilled and using corn and malted barley, we end up with a really textured, weighty spirit that's absolutely beautiful on its own. I kind of think of it like, it's a bit like a very delicate or very elegant bourbon. So it's about 95% corn, 5% malted barley, distilled through this coffee still. So we can take the ABV up to around 95%. It's then watered down to about 63% and put into very well-used American oak barrels. So we're not talking sherry casks here. We're not talking virgin oak. This is all old American oak barrels. So refill bourbon barrels, lots and lots of kind of third or fourth fill. And what we end up with is this beautiful kind of fruity, light, elegant, crisp whiskey with a nice bit of kind of coconut, toasted popcorn, that kind of flavor coming through. 45% ABV, 10 to 12 years old. And as you're kind of probably approaching the halfway mark in the cigar at this point, you've got a bit more texture in the spirit here. So you've got something a bit less light and fruity and a bit more robust, a lot more round. And this whiskey, it might not be the sexy single malts that we talk about with Japanese whiskey that cost about the same as, a mortgage on a house in London these days. But grain whiskey is kind of the unsung hero. Without a doubt, this is Nika's most important whiskey. It's not the one that gets talked about all the time, but it's the one that is the workhorse. It has all of this texture, all of this flavor, and it gives us an excellent base to add things on top of it to then create the blends that Nika is so famous for.
A question about Japanese whiskies in general.
Mm-hmm.
But as you can know, the traditional whiskies normally Scottish and Irish, etc. So when did really the hype in Japanese whiskey kind of start coming about?
So if we kind of look back historically at Japan, whiskey wasn't something that would have naturally occurred there. Japanese made sake, they made shochu, and the main reason that they made these things was because these are fermented rice-based beverages or distilled rice-based beverages. If we look at the diet of a country, if you look at the staple ingredient, it's probably likely that at some point you would start to make alcohol out of it. Think about rye grains and things in Poland. Lots of people made rye bread in Poland. They then turned to beer and vodka as a way to preserve that. In Britain, barley, right? We had loads of barley and we started making bread with it, turned that into beer. A couple of thousand years later, we started distilling that into whiskey. So Japan had lots of rice, they made sake, they made shochu, they made things like awamori. But whiskey kind of spread throughout the world with a lot, to be honest, with British colonialism. Think about the whiskeys in India and Australia, New Zealand, America and Canada. A lot of that came with British trade routes and the VOC and the East India Company and things like that. But Japan was never really taken over by the West or conquered by the West. And it didn't really have any Western visitors. They didn't like the idea of people coming into their country, changing everything around, practicing different religions. So Japan kind of saw what was happening in India and China, and they just said, no, thank you. We're going to close the borders. And so from the middle of the 1500s up until the middle of the 1800s, you didn't really see any Western presence in Japan at all. So you didn't have any spirits, no wines, no gins, rums, brandies, nothing like that. You also didn't have any art or literature or any of the more scientific papers coming in. Japan kind of missed out on an industrial revolution. And they realized in the middle of the 1800s that they were going to be left behind globally if they didn't start opening up and trading with the West. So all of a sudden, the new emperor comes to the throne and he opens up Japan's borders and says, right, cool, we're going to trade with you now. And obviously everyone in Japan just went a little bit crazy for anything Western because they'd been isolated for so long. Anything that came in with, you know, Roman letters on it or anything that was slightly non-Japanese was just seen as this incredibly, you know, luxurious, opulent thing. So whiskey started to make their way over from Scotland anyway in the kind of late 1800s. And the Japanese distillers at the time, they said, okay, so let's make some whiskey because this is obviously really popular. And the first attempts at Japanese whiskey were very much like a bartender approaching making a cocktail. So they would take their sake or their shochu or their awamori or, you know, some of the rice-based distillates they had, and they'd look at the color of the whiskey and they'd go, okay, so what can we use to add color? Let's add some tea to it. Let's add some cinnamon. Let's add some spices. So they'd get the color. Then they were like, okay, how do we get the flavor? So they started adding in things like cedarwood and incense. And they realized that they were trying to approximate the flavor of whiskey and not actually make the whiskey. So that's kind of where the idea of Japanese whiskey came from, but it obviously changed drastically after that. So we get into the early 1900s. There's a lot more availability of scotches. When I say scotches, I mean blended stuff. So we're talking, you know, Cutty Sark, Old Parr, Chivas, Haig, Johnny Walker, all of those things which are still very popular in Japan today. And the Japanese market was definitely starting to open up and people were a bit more excited about trying to produce it. And that's when they sent Takatsuru in 1918 to go to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey. And he obviously brought all that knowledge back. 1923, they opened up Yamazaki. Nikka started in 34. And then, you know, obviously you have World War II, but post-World War II, the American occupation really drove sales of whiskey up. You know, you had an enormous sort of, you know, military presence in Japan and everyone was at the bars drinking whiskey, so much so that, you know, Nikka and Suntory profits skyrocketed. And that's what kind of put Japanese whiskey on the map. And then we had, you know, all of the awards that they started winning in the early 2000s. But it's a very strange industry because in the 60s and 70s, loads of production. They had more whiskey than they knew what to do with. And then globally in the 80s, you know, no one was drinking brown spirits anymore. Everyone was, you know, drinking cosmopolitans and, you know, mojitos. Tom Cruise was there shaking up porn star martinis and things like that. Whiskey kind of died globally. You know, Scotch whiskey, a bunch of distilleries closed down, same in America, same in Japan. And then obviously no one was buying any of the whiskey. So there's just stockpiles of stuff sat there for ages. We get into the early 2000s and Nikka are like, right, we're sat on 30, 40 year plus stock that no one's going to buy. So we need to just start filtering that into some of the younger blends, into some of the younger whiskeys. And that made these whiskeys super complex, but also meant that they weren't really 10-year-old whiskeys. There was a 10-year-old in there with a lot of 20, a lot of 30, a lot of 40-year-old. And this is what really kind of ignited the fire under Japanese whiskey. Old stock bottled into younger blends at a really good price. And that's when the industry went crazy. And now we're stuck with a massive shortage of stock and massively high prices. But it was good while it lasted. That's what I always say. Sekinder at the Whiskey Exchange is always like, I bought it when it was good. That's the right style to do it.
Yeah, I went to the Yamazaki Distillery a year and a half ago. And you couldn't get any Yamazaki even at the distillery.
No, it's crazy. You know, There's so much demand for Japanese whiskey, and there's not very much supply because, you know, with grain whiskey, it's almost like turning on a tap. So the coffee grain is much, much easier to produce than a single malt. But whiskey, unlike pretty much every other style of spirit, has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years, but often for a lot longer for you to get that complexity. When we think about gins, rums, and brandies and agaves, they don't need to be aged. You know, they can come off the still, add some water, and go into bottle. Obviously, cognacs and armagnacs are a slightly different subset of brandy, but for the most part, whiskey is just the most time-consuming spirit. So if they can only make, 8 million liters a year, that's going to then sit in cask for minimum 3, often longer. And then by the time it gets to the end consumer, it might be a 10, 15, 20-year journey sometimes. So yeah, good luck trying to find any rare Japanese whiskey, even in Japan. You're more likely to find really rare old Scotch in Japan than Japanese whiskey.
Yeah, they were selling a lot of Jim Beam in the
exactly.
Yeah,
It's quite strange.
Japanese
You wander
whiskey,
around looking for some Yamazaki, and you can see Maker's Mark, Jim Beam, Macallan. Oh, okay.
Russ had a question in comparison to the coffee grain and the coffee malt. Is the taste quite comparable, or what are the differences?
So very similar production methods, but the thing that we're changing here is the grain that we're using. So the coffee grain, 95% corn, 5% malted barley, gives you flavors more akin to like an American style whiskey. So buttery, popcorn, toffee, quite citrusy as well. Now the coffee malt is a really interesting whiskey because it's 100% malted barley. It's distilled at one distillery. It's aged for a minimum of 3 years. But because it's not distilled in a pot still, we can't call it a single malt. So this is technically it's a single grain whiskey, and we're distilling 100% malted barley in the coffee still. Now what this does, this is what malted barley actually tastes like. Because when we talk about a single malt, we're talking about the creation of flavors inside the pot still. So all these chemical reactions going on during distillation, touching the copper, giving us these amazing flavor compounds. And it's why all whiskeys will taste slightly different depending on the still. Now, we don't really have those same reactions going on in a coffee still because of the mechanism, because it's that continuous distillation. But what we do have is the concentrated flavor of that grain. So for anyone that's been to a whiskey distillery, when you go into the fermentation room and it smells a bit like, sour beer, banana bread, that sort of flavor, when you distill that in a coffee still, you will just accentuate and concentrate that banana bread, sort of not yeasty characteristic, but that malty characteristic. So the coffee grain, light, fruity, and elegant. The coffee malt, a bit more dark, a bit more roasted. It's got this kind of, roasted malt, a little bit more of that Malteser, banoffee pie, a little bit of that tiramisu note on it as well. So really good whiskey to kind of try next to a single malt because you're using the same grain, similar aging process. It's just the distillation, which is slightly different. So if you are interested in seeing what continuous distillation does in comparison, the coffee malt is an excellent whiskey to try.
Great, thank you. Back to the US. Guy, I think somebody just made a comment about the beautiful band on the Avo Classic. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about the Avo Classic and also about the Avo bands, maybe. How did they come about, and what's the story behind those?
Okay, well, I just lit up the heritage. So the classic, that is just the workhorse of the brand, right? That was Avo's first baby. That's the one that's been around for 30 plus years. That's the first one that was released, and again, it happens to be just the best-selling blend in the brand. In terms of the bands, well, I mean, we've done some sort of touch-ups on the bands, but they've always been that sort of unique, elegant, small band with the interlocked, Avo, the A and the V for Avo Xo, right? What changes in between, at least in the core ones, it's just the sides, right, where there's a little bit of color added. So that's kind of like pretty much when you go and pick up a band, you'll see also in the background on between the interlocking of the lockup of the A and the V, you have the color of the band that kind of reflects each one of the lines. For example, the one that I'm smoking right now isn't the classic, it's the heritage, and the short torpedo, which is an excellent vitola for this blend, this fuller body blend, right? This one is a dark brown, kind of resembles the strength of the cigar, which is a full bodied in the core line. But in terms of the classic, it's got that creamy, beige looking, which also reflects, like I said, the strength of the cigar, because the classic would be a nice mild to medium, if that, but I would stay in the medium side of the spectrum, because it's a nice creamy, very smooth, everyday cigar. You know, that's the one that you could smoke in the morning without a problem, or, you know, at nighttime, if your nighttime, you want to slow things down. In terms of just, you know, the blend, that one, it's all, you know, Dominican tobacco. It does have the Connecticut Ecuadorian wrapper on it, but everything else is Dominican, and on the binder and the filler, right? It is a sun-grown wrapper, right? So it does have a little bit more of a kick that you would expect than a just regular Connecticut shade. But it's an excellent blend that has been, you know, indulging palates for, you know, 30 plus years. Oh, I think you're muted. Can't hear you.
We heard Nathan talk about Japanese whiskey just now. How popular is Japanese whiskey in the US? And what are your personal thoughts on Nikka?
We were talking about with Saya just now, the Yamazaki one, 18, that I got to try it just a couple of weeks ago. It's pretty expensive, very rare here. I think here, you know, it goes around probably 100 plus an ounce. So, you know, if you want to have a double on that, you know, make sure you bust out, you know, a couple $100 for that. Exquisite, very good. That night I was pairing it with, you know, some Davidoffs and Camachos. I haven't paired it with Avo yet. But no, that's excellent. You know, that's the one that, yes, it's got a lot of flavor, a lot of body, right? So you want a cigar. I would actually pair that one with the Heritage, right? To create this bold combustion of flavors in your mouth. I think that whiskey would probably overpower the classic, right? It would probably, you know, be a good battle between the whiskey and the Domain, but definitely would pair well with this Heritage.
For the Nika coffee, so I cut my teeth in bourbon growing up. My father was a bourbon drinker. I absolutely love the Nika coffee based on the fact that it has that corn influence from the flavor profile. But something that Nathan mentioned in his early description that I love is that maritime influence. You get that almost like Speyside Scotch kind of salty brine, which for me, Nika coffee is something that I can pour with any cigar and know that they're going to be a nice complement, but both of them have their own individual characteristics. And you know, you don't get that it's a very complementary flavor, but you don't get that kind of meat in the middle. They each have their own kind of natural characteristics. They're enhanced from each other, but they don't become one. I love the development of flavor, and the way that you described it actually really helps me even further through that pot distillation process, and just all of the Western and Eastern influence that meets. I think it's very noticeable in that class. To your point as well, I will say that the Nika coffee grain, so in the lounges that I was running before joining Davidoff, you know, it was kind of in the height of the secondary market explosion in Japanese whiskeys, where we talk about the age statements Japanese whiskeys that just became exorbitant in price, but also people started really exploring the segment and the marketplace. And that specific bottle, the Nika coffee grain, was something that people were able to get regularly, that also kind of brought a lot of what they were looking for in that fusion of flavor styles, but still left them with a little bit of a remnants of, you know, the roots of American whiskey and that corn base. For me, it was one of our most popular selling Japanese whiskeys, partially because we could always have it on the shelf, but also because it's just so good.
It helps when you can get hold of it, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, George, you mentioned that you wouldn't pair it with the classic necessarily. What would you pair with the classic?
It depends. Like I said, you know, the classic, it's usually, if it's not you know, some of the other Connecticut's that we have in our portfolio, it's my morning smoke, right? I absolutely love to have, say, a Robusto in the morning with my coffee, right? I try to pair it with different things. It's a great, you know, I'll probably even pair with beer, you know, in terms of that. I'll be really good lager, right? I like bourbon, right? And then the one in particular that has just, you know, throughout the years I've been, you know, because we've partnered up with them, would be Bullet Bourbon, or even Buffalo Trace, Woodford Reserve. something like that, right? That actually it doesn't I don't like whatever I'm pairing it with to overpower the cigar. And then the classic, you know, it is a milder cigar, so you have to be careful with what you're pairing it with. You know, you want to keep that balance, because if not, at that point, you know, once the cigar gets overpowered and, you know, all your taste buds starts to, you know, be opened up and you know, kind of takes away from the cigar, which, you know, as you know, the cigar will probably last you a longer time than your drink, right? Unless you have a whole bottle, then you can just keep going. But you want something to keep a balance, right? So you can continue to enjoy the 45 minutes to an hour of the cigar, right? So I mix up a lot. Every day I pair my cigars with coffee, right? That either being, you know, I usually espressos or just black American coffee. It all depends, right? So something that is not overpowering, it's what I would try to pair the classic with. Now the heritage, that one, you know, it can you know, hold its own weight in terms of whatever it is that you want to pair it with. So most likely, definitely some whiskey with the heritage, just because it's got that more, you know, a lot more body to it. So the battle there would be you know, even, you know, more fair, I would say.
And which ones are your favorite Avos?
I'm a huge fan of the Avo, the Synchro Ritmo, right? It's one of my favorite ones. Obviously, the Improvs, when they come out, I mentioned earlier, the 18 was absolutely one of my favorite ones. I still have one box of those. The 21, it's an absolute great cigar. I love bigger rain gauge. The Avo, the classic number 3, you know, another one that it's great. I wish we came back with it in a pyramid, would be the Avo Classic Maduro, right? That is a great, you know, nice medium bodied blend, but with that, you know, fermentation on that Maduro wrapper that brings out some of the sugars and chocolate notes and stuff. That's an outstanding blend. But if I had to smoke one Avo, I'd probably, I mean, you probably gonna hate me for this, but the Caribe, it's amazing. But if I had to pick one,
all right.
It would probably be the Synchro Ritmo,
Okay.
you know, and the Torpedo Largo that we have. That is just an absolute great cigar for me.
And for you, Shia?
Avo Xo is my absolute hands down favorite cigar to start the day with. Through everything that we make, the Avo Xo in the cedar tube is my absolute go-to start the day morning cigar. I love the Domain and the Heritage as well in the core line. The Domain is a cigar that I can smoke all day, every day, and it's got, you know, the nuances and the complexity, but also soft enough to be first thing in the morning. And Heritage, as George said, is just that medium to full, very complex, very robust flavor profile. From the Synchro series, the Ritmo is also my favorite, second to the Caribe. And both of us are going to apologize immensely for continuing to beat this home. But I assure you, I assure you, tomorrow when we meet back in the office, there are some boxes that are on their way, because we're already starting to feel bad about hoarding them all for ourselves.
Yeah, so you'll be getting a nice little care package.
Lovely, that would be great.
From us here.
But I love the concept of the Synchro series of using the different influences of regional tobaccos and the synchronization of that multi-regional blending process.
Yeah.
And the Ritmo and the Caribe for me are my tops in those.
Yeah,
it's funny you said the Ritmo, because the Ritmo, we actually it wasn't available in Europe for a while it was still available in the US, and the UK actually brought it over from the US at some point. We gave some samples to Mitchell, because he wanted to create an orchard selection for Avo, so we gave him different brands, and he actually also chose the Avo Synchro Ritmo to become an orchard selection in the UK. It was the box press Robusto. I think Mitchell, I think that's also one of your favorites from Avo, I would assume.
Yeah, it is. I love the Ritmo, and in fact, that was a great project to work on, because it was just simply, if I remember, you sent me all different regional editions, samples, and for me that stood out immediately as being perfect for my palate, because it was loaded with flavor but not overpowering with strength. And I thought it's going to go down really well with my clients in the UK. And it was actually one of our most successful, very limited orchard selection releases. It sold out pretty pretty fast, and it was nice because it was just a one shot into the market. Everyone had something a little bit different, a little bit special that they couldn't normally get, and yeah, it was a lovely project, very, very popular.
What's your thoughts in general on Avo, Mitchell? Because you kind of took it exclusively 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I love the range. I love the classic range. I love the heritage. I think it's a great range. I think it's just a little bit different, and it fits into our portfolio very well. Indeed, it's got an absolute place in the portfolio. The right sizes, the right flavors, and the right prices for the UK market. So we were very happy to get the exclusive in the UK. I think we're going to rationalise the range or tidy up the range, introduce a couple of new Vitolas at some stage when Paul has a few minutes to sit down with you, hopefully. And I met Avo a few times, actually quite a few times over the years at the trade shows in America. And he was really a very nice, dapper man and very nice to speak to, and very generous. And yeah, he's another great loss for our industry, unfortunately. But you know, I was lucky enough to have met him on quite a few occasions.
Me and Paul actually already had a conversation about Avo a few weeks ago, and there's a few new ones coming to the UK fairly soon. So don't know if you want to say anything more about it, Paul. I don't want to jump the gun here.
No. Certainly, we can certainly share that information. I think there's 4 lines that were selected. They're just small quantities of a single drop into the UK. All within the Synchro range. All of those sort of small to medium sort of size, very accessible, good price points. So in the next few months, we'll be dropping those into the UK marketplace.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Yes.
But we'd love to see some of those Carib over here as well, though.
You're going to love that blend.
Then we talked a little bit about the heritage. I'm smoking it at the moment. Can you explain a little bit more about the background of the heritage to kind of round off the cigar side of? You're just on mute, I think. Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
There we
I'd say
are.
it was third, fourth release, if I'm not wrong. So at this point, fuller body cigars were, in demand, right? So that's why this one is a full body blend. It's got, some roasted nuts, very cocoa flavor notes, very robust, right? It's out of the core line would be the strongest ones, right? Very one-dimensional in terms of the journey of the smoke through your mouth, right? It kind of covers the front and the back of your palate. To a degree, I would say it's a very Cubanesque flavor profile that this one has, just because of the way it affects your palate, right? And it kind of leaves the sides of your tongue pretty much dormant through the experience, right? And I'm actually, every time that I kind of recall this conversations that I had with Hanky and Klaus, kind of them explaining the cigar in particular. When they mentioned that, I was like, wow, this is incredible, right? Just because the way that it affects it, it's very similar to, Corojo tobacco, for example, that has those same traits as well. But this one, it's kind of, this blend was for the already seasoned connoisseur, right? That graduated from the milder ones to the mediums. So Avo needed to come up with something that was, bold, right? And also the name Heritage it's pretty much, to pay a big thank you to all the hands in the Dominican Republic from the the people at the farms, the rollers, the master blenders, quality control. So this is kind of like it's pretty much showcases the heritage of Dominican tobacco in around the world, right? So that's why it was named the Avo Heritage.
And
also,
sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, just to add on a little bit to that, the way that George perfectly described the stimulation and that Cubanesque feel. If you think about kind of the origin and the roots of tobacco, pre-American discovery, Hispaniola and the Cuban island, the Taino Indians prized their tobacco and existed in both places. So that Cuban style, that Cuban stimulation, and that Habano variety, which is namesake obviously for Cuba, but the seed strains existed always in Dominican Republic and Cuba kind of simultaneously. this cigar really does a great job for both old world and new world connoisseurs to kind of bring all of that in line and really speak to, you know, the 500 plus years of tobacco through the regions.
I had a quick question about, we talked about it a little bit earlier about box press. You asked the question actually. So what would you say is the main difference between a box pressed and a normal pressed cigar?
Well, it depends. It's I think also it has a lot to do with personal preference, right? I don't dislike box press cigars. In fact, I mean, I would probably prefer them for some reason, right? There's a myth, right, that people think that just to get to that shape, you have to underfill the cigars. That is just not true, at least in our operations in Honduras or in Dominican Republic. I think airflow also, you know, it's a little bit looser, if that, right? There's a little bit of a better airflow on box press, not necessarily because there's less tobacco in it, just because of the shape of the cigar, right? Kind of, you know, channels the air through a little bit better than round cigars, which are the traditional ones. That is just something that, you know, in my experience, like, again, it's something that's, you know, I guess personal preference. I personally, for example, we have, you know, one of our brands, Camacho, we have the same blend in box press and round, right? We only add just a little bit of tobacco, Pennsylvania broadleaf, to kind of change up the nuances. But the same blend smokes easier, right? The pull, the draw on the cigar is a little bit easier on the same blend. The pull is a little bit easier on the box press one than it is on the regular cylinder, right? Again, you know, they taste very similar. It's just a matter of personal preference, I would say. I like box press. Again, some of the other blends that we have, you know, even in the Avo, imagine an Avo Heritage box press. That'll be very interesting, right? Just to see all that happen. But I think it's just a very, you know, personal preference. I don't know, Shia, do you like or dislike box press?
So I generally prefer rounded cigars myself. As you mentioned, actually, for me, it's more about the feel in the hand than the feel in the mouth. But in box press, I generally prefer box press Robusto because in that smaller size, you kind of mitigate a lot of that. And to your point as well, if I'm somewhere and I'm enjoying a cigar and there's no, you know, beveled ashtray nearby, it's nice to have the utility of a box press.
Yeah.
You know, but yes, agreed. It's personal preference. I will say for sure that I notice generally in box press cigars, you have a more open draw, which actually is also not my preference. But I certainly understand the value for it.
Maybe for the people on the call, how do box press cigars keep their shape? Because with different humidities, it's quite easy for them to go back to a more natural shape.
Yeah, so basically it's the molds, right? So you have literally box press molds, and then after they're rolled, they have to be, you know, pressed, and they have to be every 45 minutes. They have to change the cigar, rotate it so it doesn't create these little I don't know
edges.
Edges, right? Sharp edges. So it actually gives that. So it's kind of, you know, and there's some out there that will lose a little bit of that squared, and they started to look a little bit more on the oval side, right? Other brands that I've seen, you know, out in the market. But yeah, basically it's the mold, right? And then they're pressed, and then every 45 minutes they're rotated for, you know, probably 3 to 4 hours before they're actually sent to the resting rooms, right? But it's just basically the mold. And after that happens, very rarely, if anything, it'll, you know, open up a little bit. So again, it'll start to go a little bit on the oval shape. But, you know, that is just very rare. Also at that point has a lot to do with humidity. You know, it's very humid, it starts to open up a little bit, but for the most part, you know, after that process is made, it remains box press, right? I very rarely, at least in any of our box press offerings throughout, you know, the whole Davidoff portfolio, I've never seen anything that it, you know, just kind of goes back to you know, being a cylinder,
Original shape,
yeah, that's just, you know, just very, very extremely unlikely.
We had a comment from Russ about you lighting a cigar with matches, being quite old school.
Yeah.
Bro.
I'm a traditionalist. Any chance I have an opportunity to use matches, if I'm indoors, I will. Something about the process, it's kind of meditative, but also I have a bit of a cooking background as well, and the easiest way to ruin any meal is to burn the oil before you start.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very delicate generally when I can in lighting the cigar to kind of preserve the oil and the flavor in that same way. A bit of a pyromaniac as well, I guess.
Yeah. Let's go back to Nathan and talk about the last whiskey, which the Nika Takatsuru.
Yes, absolutely. So we've kind of, we started with Nicodase, which is the sort of entry-level blend into Nika's portfolio, if you will, made up of those components that we talked about. We then went on to the coffee grain, which is one of those single components. The Takatsuru it's a different style of whiskey again. So in Scotland, we don't really have what we call pure malt whiskies anymore. They used to be called vatted malts, or we'd say blended malt these days. Essentially, this style of whiskey it's a blend, but only of single malts. So we're not adding that grain whiskey into it. So what we have is normally 2, 3, or 4 different distilleries all blended together, all producing single malts. Now, malts have a much bolder flavor and an oilier texture than grains. Not exclusively, there are exceptions, obviously. But what we would expect with a blended malt is to have a bit more body and a bit more kind of that robustness going on. So the Takatsuru is it's a range of whiskies that was brought out in the late 80s by Masataka Takatsuru's adopted son, Takeshi. So Takatsuru was born 1894. 1934, he started Nikka. 1969, he opened up Miyagi Kyo Distillery. And then in 1979, so 10 years later, he passed away. Now, I wouldn't shed too many tears. The man was 84 and drank whiskey every single day of his adult life. So there's obviously something to do with that ritual that keeps you alive for longer. But what he didn't get was the proper sort of aged whiskies that he wanted coming out of Miyagi Kyo to then blend into some of the older aged whiskies from Yoichi. But he had taught his son Takeshi absolutely everything that he knew about running the business. So Takeshi Takatsuru, in honor of his father, decided that he was going to bring out this range called the Takatsuru Range. And this is one of the most highly awarded ranges of whiskies in the world. So things like the World Whiskies Awards, in the last sort of 14 years, the Nika Takatsuru Range has won World's Best Blended Malt about 10 times out of 14. Whether that be for the 17, the 21, or the 25, they've always been really, really highly regarded whiskies. So one question that we get quite a lot is, why would you blend these whiskies together? And obviously everyone here is smoking a cigar and everyone is completely fine with the fact that these cigars are a blend of different leaves growing in different places. And that adds to the complexity, that adds to the aroma. And by putting these things together, it creates something that you can't find from one singular batch. Same thing with wines, right? So, if we're talking about a big Bordeaux, like a Latour or something like that, that is made up of lots of individually vinified parcels to then bring it to the Grand Vin, the big wine. So you'd have this little plot of Carmenere or Cabernet, this little plot of this, all blended together. And single malts are the same. If you think about a single malt, it is a blend of lots of different casks, all coming from the same distillery. That's fine. That's what we know as a single malt. But if we've got a blended malt, we can have the complexities of 2 or more of those single malt distilleries blended to perfection to create something that you can't find from just that single malt. So we said that Nika owns 2 distilleries. So they have Yoichi, they have Miyagi Kyo. Both produce hundreds of different styles of whiskey. And basically, they blend these 2 in different proportions to create their range. The Takatsuru is a predominant blend of the Miyagi Kyo, so that light, fruity, elegant style of whiskey, with a little bit of the Yoichi as well. Now that Yoichi is there to add power and depth and balance and a little bit of that peatiness. The Miyagi Kyo is there to be the kind of soft, welcoming, everyday, easy drinking Speyside style whiskey. Now, in terms of age on this, we're looking at around the sort of 10 to 12 year mark. You'll notice I say 10 to 12 years quite a lot when we're talking about Nika, because 10 to 12 years ago is when they started to have lots and lots of readily available stock. There is younger whiskey in this, but there is also significantly older whiskey in this as well. So if anyone's kind of seen the Nika ranges from maybe 10 years ago, you might have seen 17-year-old, 21-year-old, 25-year-old. They've unfortunately been discontinued because, like we said, the stock just isn't there. But this is now the current release of the Takatsuru. Absolutely fantastic whiskey at a really good price point. And for me, the blending of these two distilleries together really showcases what we can understand about a blend and also what the blends are doing. So if you think about the single malts as individual ingredients in a dish, you're not necessarily just going to eat that one part of the dish or the other part of the dish. But when you eat them all together, you end up with something that can only be, it can only exist because you've blended these things. So we get that beautiful freshness from the Miyagi Kyo. We get this really nice maritime sort of seasoned, salty, peppery note coming from the Yoichi. And it's 43%, so it's just got this beautiful texture on the palate as well. So we've gone down in ABV a little bit, but I think we've gone up a little bit in intensity. So if anyone's kind of started on a slightly bolder cigar or is getting towards the end of their first cigar, what we're going to have here is a really nice sort of complementary balance between the richness of the cigar and the richness of the whiskey. You're on mute, Roy.
Saw it already. What other ranges in the Nikka line are there?
So we've kind of tasted the blended range. So we've got Nicodase, which is this one here. So this is the bottling that you might see, if you were to pop into, lots of independent retailers have it, but this is the one you see in most places. So you see this in a lot of cocktail bars, places like that. After the Nicodase, we've obviously got things like Nika from the barrel, which you might be familiar with, the small square-shaped bottle. Again, that's just a slightly older version of a very similar blend. Then if we go to the other end of the blend spectrum, we've got things like the Nika Taylors, which is this one here. So it's a big decanter style bottle, and this retails for about 120, 125 pounds. And what we've got here is much older whiskies going into the blends. So that's kind of like the basic core range from Nika on the blends. We've then got what we call the coffee range, which is the coffee grain, the coffee malt, then also the gin and the vodka as well. Nika brought the gin and the vodka out in 2017, 2018. And a lot of people said, well, what's the point of bringing out gin and vodka? You've already made the whiskey. You don't need something quick and easy to fill it out. If we think about a lot of the younger distilleries that have just started opening, gin and vodka is a nice way to get some money coming in while you're waiting for your whiskey to age. But Nika wanted to bring those out to showcase the versatility of the coffee still, but also the skill of their blenders in creating a range of whiskeys and spirits. Then after the coffee range, which is all of the grain whiskey and the gin and the vodka, they've got the malts. So the malts are Yoichi and Miyagi Kyo as the sort of core standalone pillars of Nika. And then we've got the blended malt, which is the Takatsuru. Now that's pretty much the full range, but you might see a few other bottlings sort of crop up every now and then. And I know Paul's always got some stashed away up in Liverpool. Things like the finishes. So this would be the Miyagi Kyo sherry wood finish. Then there was the rum wood finish. There was the bourbon wood finish. And these were limited releases that were brought out at pretty much October, November time every year, just as a way to basically keep some interest in the range. Because a lot of people were quite upset at the fact that all the age statements got discontinued, and rightly so. But if you don't have the stock, you can't make it. So this was just a way for Nika to bring out something a little more special that the connoisseurs could search for if they wanted to. And they are slightly more expensive, but I think they're absolutely delicious. So Nika has all of the different styles of whiskey you'd find in Scotland. It's got its grains, it's got its blends, it's got its single malts, and everything is kept in-house. And you'll see this with Suntory as well, and you'll see this with a lot of the older style Japanese distilleries. No one really trades casks or swaps anything. It's not like in Scotland where it's kind of like open season. Everyone trades casks with each other. There's a massive brokering market. That doesn't really happen in Japan. It's happening less in Scotland now because bigger brands like Diageo own all of the single malt distilleries they need to produce Johnny Walker. So they don't really buy and borrow that much anymore. But historically they did. Whereas in Japan, everything was kept in-house and they needed to try and create as many styles of whiskey as possible in-house to add complexity to the blends. So the Nika range has every different style of whiskey you could imagine. I mean, I've had, my mother who hates whiskey or hates spirits, or hates a strong word, has a disposition to not liking spirits. When she tasted the coffee grain and the Nika Day, she was like, okay, these are light enough and fruity enough and subtle enough for me to really enjoy them. But also if you've got someone that really likes peaty Isla style whiskey, you can go straight into the Yoichi. If you know someone that likes, old style blends, and something like Nika from the barrel or Nika Tailored works really well too. So you can really have a deep dive into the entire portfolio, and there's a lot of different styles of whiskey that they've got there.
Great, thank you. We go back to Avo for a second. We had a question about the Avo. I'm only about the Avo Puritos. Jason smokes them on a regular basis. The tin says handmade. Are they long or short filler?
They are long filler. So anything that we do in production that is not a cigarillo is both handmade and long filler.
Mm-hmm. And when did the Puritos come into production?
Oh, wow. That was actually, I would say, early 2000s. The domain had a burritos, offering as well. Got discontinued, just a handful of years ago. Also, the classic does have a burritos. You have the Fogata also that had some burritos. The Nicaragua as well. Nothing in Synchro or Ritmo, right? But yeah, it's something that at least here in the U.S. market, it sells, but it's not, like the big vitolas, right? But they are, like Shia was saying, they're long filler, they're handmade. But yeah, I would say like the first ones for the classic, for example, that was probably, early 2000s, probably a good, 8 years after the brand was launched, right? That is as far as I know that here in the US.
So how does the blend affect the size of the cigar? Looking at the burritos, so we got them in different blends.
Yeah, let's just say you would be, tasting, and that's what happens with for example, bigger ring gauge cigars, right? You get to taste a lot more of the filler and the binder, right? But mostly the filler. So that's where, if you have a good blend that has powerful, fillers, it'll enhance the blend a little bit more, right? That's the kind of like the opposite on the burritos. You get, a little bit on the smaller side of the blend in terms of the filler, right? But for the most part, just in the portfolio that we have, I think they're very mild. The construction is impeccable. It is very remarkable when you actually see the rollers rolling these tiny cigars to perfection. Draw construction, the way that they bunch the filler into this very small cigar, it's just outstanding, right? But for the most part, I don't think that at least in the Avo production of burritos, that there is a bolder burrito, just because of the wrappers that we use on just the ones that I mentioned. Possibly the Fogata would be the boldest one, right? Or possibly even the Nicaragua, but I think the Fogata will be the boldest one, just because of that Ecuadorian Habano wrapper that we use on that one, right?
What else can we expect from Avo in the future? What you can share, at least.
I did hint you guys on the.
You did hint me already a little bit.
I teased you on the the improv for next year is going to be very interesting. Again, we still have to again mention Caribe. That's a big strong launch that we actually launching today here in the U.S. Once I get off this phone call, I'll start to get share some things on social media. But that's as far as I can share. That is it. We will have that improv next year. That is very interesting. Brings pretty much everything together. And then Caribe. Hopefully Caribe, you guys will be able to get it over there at some point. And well, you'll be getting it sooner than everybody else, because we'll send you a few for you to try and get to indulge in this great blend. That it's a hit. That one, it's a hit. Other than that, just again, trying to keep Avo's vision flow relevant, keep the legacy of the man that left us a few years ago. That's pretty much our mission here, right? Everything that revolves around the brand, we try to always think back and try to tie the man into everything that we do on a daily basis here.
Also, the energy and the initiative behind Classic Maduro and the growing strength, popularity, and the way it's been received. Classic Maduro, I think, solves a lot of problems for a lot of people, especially in the United States market, in that manufacturers over the last probably 10 years have really started to adjust kind of from an industry perspective, not necessarily ours internally, but adding more Ligero and stronger tobaccos in the filler in Maduro cigars, because the natural perception or the assumption from the consumer is the darker the cigar, the stronger. And Avo Classic is very much true to its name. It is a classic Maduro. It is sweeter, it is richer, it is more flavorful without being any stronger than the classic. So I think, you know, we have to absolutely mention one of my absolute favorites, the classic Maduro. It's nice to have that kind of old world original Maduro back in the marketplace in such a strong blend.
Perfect. Thank you. Unless anybody else has any questions for either Nathan or the guys in the US from Avo, then ask now. If not, we're going to round up the call so everybody can go back to their day.
Yeah, right. Just a couple of mentions. Just on the Avo Puritos, they're a big favourite in the UK marketplace, and you mentioned that there's a couple of lines that are being discontinued, but between Roy and myself, we've actually secured a good allocations of stocks to secure us, certainly through the medium term here in the UK marketplace.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
So
whatever you don't sell in the US, sell to the UK. They're sent to the UK, and we'll get rid of it.
we'll sell them.
Yeah.
We'll make sure of that.
And Roy, it's just it'll be good to mention our recent exclusive release, the Davidoff exclusive Orchard Selection Liverpool edition. Mitchell, have you got a few comments on that? And I'm going to actually post into the chat our next Zoom call, which you can join us on the 9th of September, I believe.
Correct.
And being paired with Remy. Mitchell.
Remy Martin XO, and have we got Sam on the call as well?
I think I'd only add that we were very proud to do the first Davidoff Orchard Selection as a Lancero a couple of years back, which was phenomenally popular, and it was an incredible blend. The Toro we've come out with now is really a cracker. It's really a cigar for the connoisseur. It's a full-bodied cigar. It's got a lot going on in that blend. It's truly 3/3 of deliciousness and development of flavour. It's a super premium, and it's quite a treat. They're not cheap, but they are absolutely excellent. If you don't want to commit to a box, try one or two, because for a special occasion, they're really something very special, as a few of my friends on this call have already attested to. So we're very proud to follow the London edition with the Liverpool edition, because we're very proud to be in Liverpool, which is where our retail heritage started in 1817. We're the second oldest cigar specialist in the UK. So I suppose we're paying a bit of homage to our roots in Liverpool. So yeah, I'd really commend that as being a first-rate, super premium Davidoff cigar.
Somebody's already saying an Everton edition would be even better.
Sorry, but I don't know anything about football. I'm very non-political.
I'm joking there somewhere. Yeah.
I've just posted the link to the next Zoom call, so anybody that's on this call, you're more than welcome to join, purchase the sampler. It's a fabulous cigar. I've yet to try, but I've heard great things.
You're always away, Paul.
He really is.
I'll be back soon.
Well, thank you to the guys in the US for joining us this evening and giving us so much insight on Avo, about the history and the cigars we smoked. The same goes for Nathan, about his insight on the range of Nikkas we've tried this evening, and also a bit about the background of Nikka. As I mentioned at the beginning, this session has been recorded and will be available on the CGars YouTube channel at some point in the next 2 weeks, I would imagine. So if you can, join us on the 9th of September for the Liverpool edition, which will again be a great event. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for hosting.
It was a good session. It was very interesting. Nathan, thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed it. Very, very educational, even for me.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mitchell.
And thanks to all of our viewers. Thanks for joining. Thanks for all the great questions. I hope you enjoyed the cigars and the whiskey, and look forward to doing it again very soon, in person or virtually.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night,
everybody.
Take care. Good night.
Thank you.
All right.
Cheers.